It was a humid August evening in 1980 when Reverend Elijah Moore walked out of his small wooden chapel in Mississippi and was never seen again. No car, no footprints, just a half-drunk glass of sweet tea on the porch, and his worn Bible left open on the book of Exodus. The community searched for weeks. The local sheriff called in dogs, divers, and even psychics. But it was as if the ground had swallowed him whole. And slowly, painfully, the congregation that once sang under his voice began to fall silent, grief turning to rumor, then to silence, then to forgetfulness. But memory has a strange way of waiting in places no one thinks to look. And nearly 3 decades later, a 12-year-old boy casting his line into a muddy riverbank stumbled upon something tangled in the roots of a fallen tree. It wasn't bones. It wasn't clothes. It was something far more haunting. A box, locked shut, wooden, old, but impossibly preserved. On the lid, carved faintly by hand, were the words, "Let the truth be lifted only by the innocent." When the boy opened it, he didn't understand what he was looking at. Photographs, torn pages, a small silver cross stained with what looked like rust or something darker. But the note resting on top said enough to freeze the heart of everyone who later saw it. I did not run. I was taken. And if you're reading this, then it's starting again. The story spread fast. Local news, then state, then national. And just like that, a name almost erased by time, Elijah Moore, came surging back into the light, not as a man, but as a warning. Questions resurfaced. Why had his sermons been removed from the church archive? Why had his last 3 letters home been intercepted? And why did the church board insist on calling his disappearance a moral failing rather than a crime? This isn't just a story about a man who vanished. It's a story about the power of silence and the cost of breaking it. Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it waits for the right hands to uncover it. And sometimes when a boy goes fishing, what he pulls from the water is not a fish, but a truth that changes everything. The boy's name was James Whitaker, and he had no idea that his lazy summer afternoon would awaken a ghost the town had worked hard to forget. He was quiet by nature, the kind of kid who didn't say much but saw everything. That day, the river had receded more than usual, exposing the twisted roots of an old cypress. It was there, tangled between mud and memory, that he found the box, weathered, carved, sealed shut like a secret held too long. James didn't open it right away. He stared at it for nearly 10 minutes, tracing the carvings with trembling fingers. He said later that it felt warm, even though the water had been cold. He brought it home, tucked beneath his shirt, and when his grandfather, a retired deacon, saw the box, he went pale. Not surprised, not curious, just terrified. He locked it in the shed and told James never to speak of it again. But that night, James couldn't sleep. He swore he heard humming coming from the shed. Gospel music, slow and sorrowful. He crept outside, heart racing, and stood by the locked door. The humming stopped, and then, quietly, he heard it, a voice. Faint, but clear. Let the truth breathe. The next morning, the box was gone. But James had already seen enough to start asking questions. He returned to the river every day after that, searching, waiting. Sometimes he thought he saw someone standing on the opposite bank, dressed in black, motionless. But every time he blinked, they were gone. He told his teacher, who told his mother, who brought in a counselor. But no one believed the boy, because no one wanted to remember the pastor who vanished. Not now. Not again. James started researching on his own. He asked old men in barber shops, dug through library archives, even found dusty church bulletins from the late 1970s. That's when he saw the name, Reverend Elijah Moore. The last sermon listed under his name was dated July 6, 1980. Then nothing. No resignation. No obituary. Just absence. And in a town where silence kept peace, absence was safer than answers. It was Miss Althea Daniels, the oldest member of the original congregation, who finally broke the silence. James approached her after Sunday service, clutching a printed photo of Reverend Moore. Her hands trembled the moment she saw it, and her eyes, clouded by time, suddenly sharpened with memory. "You found it, didn't you?" she whispered. He hadn't told her anything, but somehow she knew. They sat for hours on her porch, the summer breeze brushing through the chimes. She spoke of Elijah as a man of strength and gentleness, a preacher who walked the streets after dark just to check on widows, who never locked his door because he said the Lord was always his guard. She said he'd been troubled near the end, quiet, distracted, talking about things moving in shadows and eyes in the choir that didn't belong. She remembered the night he vanished, said she'd been the last to see him. He had given her a sealed letter and asked her not to open it unless he didn't return by sunrise. But she never opened it. She couldn't. Fear had wrapped around her like a shroud, and the next morning, when he was gone, the letter went into the fire. Or so she claimed. Her voice cracked when she said it, and James wasn't sure whether the guilt or the memory hurt her more. When James pressed her, gently, about why no one ever investigated properly, she looked at him with a sorrow he couldn't describe. Because the people who should have asked the questions were the same ones afraid of the answers, she said. And when a black man disappears in a town that still whispers in codes, folks learn fast to call it God's will and move on. The bitterness in her voice wasn't just about Elijah. It was about everything he represented, and everything they lost when he was taken. That night, James wrote Elijah's name on a blank page and circled it. He didn't know why, but something told him the story wasn't just about a man. It was about something he knew, something someone wanted buried, and maybe something still watching from the riverbank. In the following days, James became obsessed. He skipped games with friends, ignored cartoons, and spent his afternoons in the town's small library combing through old microfilm. Something about the pastor's disappearance gnawed at him. It wasn't just that no one had answers. It was that no one wanted them. The deeper he looked, the more he found the gaps were intentional. Newspaper clippings were missing. Church newsletters stopped abruptly. And any mention of Elijah's final month was either blacked out or strangely vague. Then he stumbled upon something odd in a dusty old church ledger, a financial record dated 1 week before Elijah vanished. It showed a donation from a name James didn't recognize, Jonathan Avery, accompanied by a memo that simply read, "For the Circle." The amount was large, especially for a rural congregation, for $1,000 in 1980 money. The following week, Elijah was gone. There was no other mention of Avery in any other record. Curiosity turned to urgency. James showed the document to his grandfather, hoping for guidance. But the old man stared at the paper, face tense, and then quietly folded it. "This is not your burden, son," he said, voice cracking. "Let sleeping things lie." James pushed back. "Was he your friend?" he asked. His grandfather only nodded and walked away, leaving James more certain than ever. There were people in town who knew, and they had chosen silence over justice. That night, James returned to the river. He sat in the same spot where he found the box. The moon hung low, and the water was eerily still. As he traced the carved words in his memory, "Let the truth be lifted only by the innocent," he whispered Reverend Elijah's name like a prayer. The wind shifted. Something rippled across the surface, and just before he stood to leave, his flashlight caught something buried in the mud. He pulled at it slowly. It was another box, smaller, rusted. No carvings this time, just initials, EM. And beneath them, etched faintly into the corroded metal, were the words, "They sang without souls." The box was sealed tightly, rusted at the hinges, but James was determined. He brought it home and, after struggling for nearly an hour, managed to pry it open with a screwdriver. Inside were items preserved with uncanny care. A silver pocket watch, a single white glove, a hymnal open to Psalm 91, and a roll of undeveloped film wrapped in cloth. But there was also a note, this one handwritten, smudged but readable. "If this box is found, then I am not safe. Nor are you. There is something inside the music, something they welcomed, but could not contain. Forgive me. I try to stop it. I try to save them." It was signed, Reverend Elijah Moore. James felt his hand shaking. What could he possibly mean? Something inside the music. He turned to the hymnal, flipping through its pages. Several lines had been underlined in red ink. "He shall cover thee with his feathers. Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night." Each passage read more like a warning than a comfort. And at the very end, in the final margin, Elijah had written, "It started with a choir." James took the roll of film to the only place in town that still developed photographs. He lied to the clerk, saying it was from his grandmother's attic. The man said it would take 2 days. James waited anxiously, replaying every word, every clue. What had Elijah discovered in the final weeks? What had the church invited, or conjured, that scared even the strongest man of faith? When the photographs were finally ready, James opened the envelope with trembling hands. Most were blurry, old, faded, but one photo made him stop breathing. It was the church choir, 12 members, all smiling. But in the background, barely visible through the stained glass window, stood a figure in black. No face, no features, just a silhouette, watching from outside. And Elijah, standing apart from the group, looking directly at the camera, not smiling. James turned the photo over. A date was scribbled on the back, July 6th, 1980, the day of Elijah's final sermon. James stared at the photo for hours that night. Something about the faceless figure in the window burned into his memory. It wasn't just eerie, it felt deliberate, as if it were meant to be seen by someone who would understand. He traced the image of Reverend Elijah again and again. Why had he stood apart from the others? Why was he the only one not smiling? The next day, James returned to Miss Althea with the photograph. She gasped the moment she saw it. Her fingers trembled as she touched the edge. "This was the choir," she whispered. "The year they sang that new piece." Said it came from a visiting bishop, though no one ever remembered his name. She leaned closer to the image, then paled. That window, Reverend Moore had it boarded up 2 days later. Said the light was wrong. Said it was showing him things no man should see. James asked her about the song. She closed her eyes, and, after a long pause, began to hum a haunting melody. Slow, minor key, unfamiliar. "They only performed it once," she said. The congregation clapped. But that night, Sister Rayford started screaming in her sleep. Then Deacon Will stopped speaking entirely. Said there were whispers under the organ when no one was in the room. James asked if anyone had recorded the performance. Althea nodded reluctantly. There was a tape. The original church pianist kept it. Said it was beautiful, sacred. But when his dog died without cause and his wife went blind, he blamed the music. "I heard he buried the tape beneath the old magnolia tree in his backyard before he moved out of town." Her voice broke, and no one has sung it since. That evening, James biked across town to the abandoned house. The magnolia still stood, massive, ancient. Its roots had cracked the concrete steps. He didn't hesitate. With a small shovel, he dug into the dirt near the base. Just a few inches down, his fingers struck metal. A cassette, labeled with a single word in red ink, "Deliverance." James didn't have a cassette player at home, so he took the tape to the only person he knew would have one, his science teacher, Mr. Hill, who collected vintage electronics. Mr. Hill raised an eyebrow at the tape's condition, but agreed to help. As the wheels began to turn and the magnetic hiss filled the room, James felt his skin tighten. The melody started soft, angelic harmonies, echoing faintly like a distant lullaby. But soon the tone shifted. Dissonance crept in. Beneath the voices, a low vibration emerged, something not quite instrumental. It sounded alive. James could feel it beneath his ribs, like something crawling behind his heartbeat. At the 2-minute mark, Mr. Hill abruptly stopped the tape, his hand shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "That wasn't music. That was something else." He refused to let James take the cassette and locked it in a drawer. "You need to leave this alone." But James couldn't, because as disturbing as the melody had been, something in the background had spoken, not in lyrics, but in rhythm. And James had recognized the pattern. It matched the humming he heard that first night by the shed. Later that evening, James returned home and began studying the photographs again. He played the melody from memory, humming it slowly. As he reached the final note, a whisper echoed through his room, not from the air, but from the walls. Just one word, but it made him freeze. Return. The next morning, the front door to the church, locked for over 2 decades, was wide open. James didn't tell anyone about the church door. He simply biked there just after dawn, when the streets were empty and the sky still unsure whether to rise or rain. The building loomed larger than he remembered. The wood faded to gray, vines creeping up its spine. No light came from within. No bird sang nearby. It was as if the structure had been removed from time itself. He stepped inside, heart pounding. The air was thick, musty, but not with age. It smelled like wet stone and something sweeter, like burnt sugar. The pews were still aligned, covered in dust and cobwebs, and the pulpit stood intact, though cracked along its edges. On the wall behind it, the cross had fallen, split cleanly in half. But what drew James's eyes was the organ. It looked untouched, polished, gleaming, pristine. The keys were ivory white, glowing faintly as if lit from within. On the bench, a hymn sheet rested. The title? Deliverance. But the notes were wrong. They didn't follow any musical scale James recognized. They curled like serpents across the staff lines, symbols that looked more like runes than melodies. As he reached for the paper, the temperature dropped. Every hair on his body stood on end. And then, a sound. A breath, not his. Long, deep. Right behind him. James turned quickly. No one. But the pews were no longer empty. For a second, just a second, he saw shadows sitting there. Outlines of people. Heads bowed. Faces unseen. Then they vanished. Terrified, James fled the church. But as he reached the threshold, he saw something scrawled across the inside of the door that hadn't been there before. 3 words, written in deep red, "Do not sing." The warnings echoed in James's head the entire day. He tried to return to normal, to eat, to sleep, but nothing felt real anymore. He had opened a door that had remained sealed for nearly 30 years, and someone, had been waiting behind it. That night, he dreamed of the church. In his vision, the choir sang again, their mouths open wider than humanly possible, their voices rising in tones not of joy, but of anguish. He awoke sweating, gasping for air, and he wasn't alone. His radio had turned on by itself, playing static. But beneath the static, buried like a ghost beneath snow, was that same melody from the tape. It stopped the moment he stood up. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound. James began to understand this wasn't just about Elijah Moore. It was about something he had fought to contain, and failed. Driven by fear but also duty, James returned to Miss Althea. She was waiting for him, as if she'd known he would come. He told her everything. About the organ, the shadows, the warning. She listened in silence, then said something that changed everything. He wrote another letter. Why didn't burn? From a worn Bible hidden beneath her bed, she retrieved a yellowed envelope. Inside was a final note from Elijah, dated July 5th, 1980. If they find this, know I did what I could. The song is not of heaven. It is not of earth. It speaks in tones the soul cannot understand without breaking. The choir was deceived. The elders welcomed it thinking it was divine. But I saw its true face. I saw it smile behind the veil. James could hardly breathe. Althea placed a hand on his. He tried to stop it. You're the first one who's listened since. She paused, and I think it's listening back. That night, as thunder rolled in the distance, James heard the melody again, hummed softly from under his bed. James didn't scream. He couldn't. The moment he heard the humming beneath his bed, every muscle in his body seized with cold paralysis. He leaned down slowly, praying to find a malfunctioning device, maybe the radio again. But there was nothing, just darkness and dust. And then silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, charged kind that feels like it's waiting for your next move. The next morning, James noticed something unusual on his bedroom wall. 3 small symbols etched into the plaster near his window. They matched the shapes on the corrupted hymn sheet in the church. He hadn't drawn them. No one had. They weren't there the night before. He tried to scrub them off, but the more he scrubbed, the deeper they seemed to sink into the wall, as if they were never on the surface, but inside it. Desperate, James brought the symbols to Mr. Hill. The teacher paled when he saw them. He pulled an old folklore book from a locked cabinet and flipped feverishly through the pages. There, near the center, was an illustration that matched exactly. Symbols known as seals of sound, used in ancient rituals believed to invite divine beings. But the footnote was chilling. Often mistaken for angels, these beings are not messengers. They are echoes of fallen harmony, beautiful, but devouring. James finally asked the question that had been sitting on his chest for days. What if Reverend Elijah wasn't just warning us to stop listening, but to stop remembering? Mr. Hill looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. Then you're already too late, he said softly, because memory is sound that never dies, and you've already heard it. That night, James locked every door, shut every window, and stuffed cloth into his ears. But the humming still came. not through his ears, but from inside his skull. It vibrated in his teeth, his ribs, his spine. And, at the crescendo, as he curled into himself on the floor, he heard a voice say, "You are the new choir." The following day, James made a decision. He would go back to the church, alone, and burn whatever was left. The sheet music, the organ, the walls if he had to. He knew now that the melody wasn't just haunting him. It was recruiting him. The symbols, the dreams, the whispers, they weren't warnings. They were invitations. And someone or something had chosen him. He brought gasoline, matches, and the hymnal with Elijah's notes. The air around the church was thick with tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath. As he approached, he noticed something chilling. Fresh footprints in the dust by the steps. Bare feet, leading into the church. Not out. He stepped inside, heart pounding like a drum in a funeral procession. The pews were empty again, the organ untouched. But on the pulpit stood something new. A frame. Inside it, the photograph of the choir he had found weeks ago. Except this time, Reverend Moore had been scratched out. His face gone, replaced by a mirror. When James looked into it, he saw his own reflection, smiling. Panic surged, but James forced himself forward. He doused the organ, the pulpit, and the pews. When he lit the match, the fire caught immediately. But as the flames rose, so did the melody, no longer from a tape or dream, but from within the building itself. It sang as it burned, not in pain, but in praise. He fled outside, watching as the church blazed, the stained glass windows shattering in bursts of color and heat. But just before the roof collapsed, he saw it. Through the flames, in the last window still intact. A man in black, standing, watching, waiting. James fell to his knees, not in defeat, but in understanding. The church burned for hours. Firefighters arrived too late to save anything, and the crowd that gathered stood in eerie silence, as though the flames themselves had demanded reverence. James stayed across the street, hidden behind a tree, unable to move. He watched the roof collapse inward, smoke curling toward the heavens, carrying with it the final chords of that cursed melody. But the strange thing was, no one questioned the fire. Not one person in the crowd asked how it had started. Not one mentioned the smell of gasoline. It was as if the town expected it, as if they'd known this day was coming for decades. And when the last ember died, the people turned and walked away, quiet, orderly, as though a chapter had finally been closed. James didn't feel closure. He felt marked. In the days that followed, he stopped dreaming entirely. No nightmares, no images, just endless black. And during the day, he began hearing whispers in silence. Not in words, but in tones. Low frequencies under conversations. Chords hidden beneath birdsong. Even the hum of power lines now sounded like verses. The song had followed him. Or worse, had never been confined to the church in the first place. Desperate for answers, he returned to Miss Althea. Her house was dark, the door slightly open. Inside, nothing had been disturbed, but she was gone. Only a single item remained on her kitchen table, a postcard. On it, an old photograph of a chapel in ruins. On the back, in her handwriting, he was only the first. Find the others. Others. The word rang in his skull. James realized something he hadn't considered. Elijah Moore hadn't been alone in resisting the melody. Somewhere out, there were more people, more fragments of this buried symphony. The church was gone, but the song was still playing. And now, James wasn't just a listener. He was becoming part of the choir. The postcard led James to an abandoned settlement nearly 40 miles outside town. Just fields, a dried-up well, and the ruins of a stone chapel overtaken by vines. Locals called it Whistler's Hollow, though no one could explain why. James arrived as the sun was setting, painting the horizon in shades of fire. The air was still, heavy, and filled with a faint, sweet aroma, burnt sugar again. Inside the chapel's remains, he found cracked pews, a collapsed altar, and beneath a floorboard, a locked wooden chest. Carved into the lid were the same symbols he'd seen in his room, now accompanied by Latin inscriptions. James didn't know the language, but he recognized one repeated word. Vox. Voice. He forced the chest open with a crowbar. Inside were brutal sheets of music, dated from as far back as 1912. And beneath them, a journal. The handwriting matched Elijah Moore's. At the top of the first page, "This is not a song. It is a doorway." James read for hours, trembling. The notes described people across generations who had heard the melody, through dreams, through water, through stone. Most ended in madness, some in disappearance. But a few, like Elijah, tried to contain it. In the final entry, Elijah wrote, "The boy who finds this must understand. It doesn't want fame. It wants form. It needs voices, heart's belief. That's the price. That's the choir." James looked up, heart racing. The air was vibrating again, that same low hum. But this time, it wasn't coming from around him. It was rising from within him. He dropped the journal and fled the chapel, wind slicing at his face, the stars above swirling as if the sky itself had tilted. He realized then, burning the church had only scattered the melody, and now it was rewriting itself inside him. James barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard voices, overlapping, layered, singing in harmonies that shouldn't exist. Not melodies made for human ears. They rose and fell like waves crashing on an invisible shore, sometimes soft as whispers, sometimes so loud they made his bones ache. And through it all, a single phrase repeated in that strange tongue. Vox venit. The voice is coming. In the morning, James's reflection looked thinner, his eyes deeper, darker. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion or something else, something internal. He tried to ground himself with normal routines, but even brushing his teeth became surreal. The sound of the bristles echoed louder than they should. The faucet drip pulsed like a metronome. Reality was unraveling, one thread at a time. That afternoon, a letter arrived at his door. No name, no return address. Just a wax seal and a note written in sharp, slanted handwriting. "We heard what you burned. Meet us at dusk. Old train yard." James knew he should be afraid, but instead, he felt hope. There were others. People like him. Maybe not free, but awake. The train yard was forgotten by most. A graveyard of rust and silence. James arrived just as the sky turned gold. Waiting near a derailed carriage were three figures, faces hidden under dark hoods. One stepped forward, removing hers. She was older, eyes fierce. "You've opened the final stanza," she said. "We've waited 30 years for someone to finish it." Her name was Lillian. She had been part of a resistance once. Others who followed Elijah's warnings and went into hiding when the melody began to surface again in the 1980s. Lillian handed James a small, leather-bound book. Inside were notes, coded lyrics, locations, and names, survivors, musicians, clergy, even monks who had recorded similar encounters. "You're the first to survive the full refrain," she said. "But surviving isn't the same as resisting. The song now sleeps in your bones. It will try to use you, to complete itself. But there's one place left that might still hold the final silence." That night, James sat alone on the roof of his home, staring at the stars, the book resting on his lap. Each page vibrated with possibility and dread. The entries were cryptic, poems written like spells, coordinates scribbled beside unfamiliar names. But one page was clearer than the rest. Sanctum Auditatis, where sound dies. A monastery in the Appalachian Mountains, closed since 1953, said to be built on a bed of quartz that absorbed frequency. It was a place where monks once took vows of silence, not just out of discipline, but protection. According to the notes, they had encountered a sound they could not identify, a chord outside the scale of creation. Elijah had written, "There, I saw it, the note between notes, the rest that breathes." It called itself the listener. James knew then, if he was going to survive, if he had any chance of breaking the melody's grip, he had to go there. He would journey to the sanctum, not to silence the song, but to ask it what it wanted, before it finished composing itself through him. But before he could leave, he noticed something chilling. The three symbols from his wall, ones he'd seen in the chapel, were now appearing on his skin. Faint, like burn marks just beneath the surface. And when he touched them, he didn't feel pain. He felt harmony, resonance. The melody had chosen him as a vessel, but he still had a choice. He could finish the song, or he could end it, where sound itself had once gone to die. James set out for the Appalachian Mountains before sunrise. With only Elijah's journal, the sealed hymn book, and the coordinates marked Sanctum Auditus, he drove through fog-covered roads and decaying towns that seemed untouched by time. Every so often, he'd hear it, the faint chorus in the static of the radio, in the whistle of the wind through trees, in the low hum of power lines. The song was with him now, a presence beneath his breath. After nearly 2 days of travel, he reached the base of the mountain trail. The air was colder there, even in midsummer. Locals had warned him not to go further, their expressions growing grave at the mere mention of the old monastery. Some said no birds ever flew near it. Others claimed even compasses spun wildly in its presence. But James pressed on, driven by something deeper than fear, a need for truth, or maybe redemption. The trail was narrow, winding through dense forest. Every step felt heavier, like the earth itself resisted his passage. Hours passed in silence, save for the occasional snap of a branch or distant crackle of unseen wildlife. But just as night began to fall, he reached it, a massive stone gate, half buried in ivy, marked with the same 3 symbols that had haunted him for weeks. The monastery rose beyond, black against the blood-red sky. Inside, the air was impossibly still. Dust covered the pews and pillars. The only sound was his own breath, until he entered the main hall. There, laid across the stone altar, was a body. Not decomposed, not rotting, preserved, as if the person had only just lain down to rest. His hands were clasped over a scroll, his eyes closed, face serene. James approached slowly. The man was dressed in a monk's robe, but what caught his attention was the scar on his left hand, a symbol James recognized from the hymn book. This man, whoever he was, had once heard the song too. With trembling hands, James opened the scroll. The text was ancient, but part of it had been translated, perhaps by Elijah or someone before him. It read, "When the voice completes itself, it no longer sings, it consumes, not out of malice, but nature, like fire eats air." Beneath the passage, a warning, seal it with silence, or become its sound. Suddenly, the walls of the monastery groaned. The stones seemed to vibrate, low and deep. James turned sharply. No wind, no footsteps, but he felt it, something awakening beneath his feet. The monastery wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a prison, and the voice had never been truly silent, only asleep. James climbed to the tower, the highest point of the structure. From there, he could see the valley stretch endlessly in all directions. But more importantly, he could hear nothing. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It was as if he stood inside a vacuum. The Sanctum Auditus wasn't named by monks. It was named by something else that had once heard itself for the first time and wanted more. And then came the sound, not through the air, but from within his chest. A low, resonant tone, like a tuning fork being struck against his spine. His vision blurred. His heartbeat fell into rhythm with it. The symbols on his skin began to glow faintly. And suddenly, he wasn't alone. A figure stepped from the shadows behind the bell tower. Robed, hooded, face obscured. But when it spoke, it used James's own voice. "You brought it this far," it said. "Now sing." James staggered back. "What are you?" he asked. The figure stepped closer, lifting the hymn book from James's satchel. "I am the echo of every forgotten note. I am what your world left behind when it tuned itself to order. I am harmony without restraint." And then, with one hand raised, it pointed to the valley below. They are listening now. James stood frozen at the edge of the tower, staring at the robed figure that now held the hymn book like scripture. The pages fluttered in the windless air, each one humming softly, as if breathing. The symbols inked on James's skin pulsed brighter, sinking to a rhythm he didn't recognize but couldn't resist. And below, far across the darkening valley, faint lights began to appear, windows lighting up one by one in the distant towns. "They've always heard it," the figure said. "But now, through you, they remember it." James wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The monastery had sealed itself. The stone arch behind him had vanished, and in its place, only shadow remained, thick, moving shadow that pulsed with soundless voices. The figure gestured to the sky, and James looked up. The stars above were flickering, not like fire, but like broken notes on a dying radio. Patterns shifted in the constellations, forming something unnatural. An eye, a sigil, a mouth. He couldn't tell, but he could feel it looking back at him. Listening. Waiting. The hymn book glowed now, not with fire, but with resonance. Each note on the page began to lift from the surface like mist, and James realized in horror that the melody was no longer written. It was becoming alive. He heard every version ever sung across centuries, every choir, every whisper, every scream stitched into the same song. And then the figure turned to James and placed the book in his hands. Complete it, or carry it forever. The choice wasn't freedom versus servitude. It was annihilation versus absorption. Either he became the vessel willingly, or the melody would find another way through his voice, his memory, his soul. But James didn't sing. Instead, he knelt. Slowly, deliberately, he set the hymn book on the stone floor of the tower and began tearing out the pages, one by one. Each page that tore let out a deafening shriek, as if the song itself was being wounded. The figure staggered back, clutching its head, the hood falling away to reveal James. It was his face, pale, hollow-eyed, a version of him that had already surrendered to the melody. "You can't silence me," it growled. "I am you." James shook his head. "No, you're only the part of me that listened." And with that, he dropped the final page from the tower into the void below. As it fell, it burned, not with flame, but with light, radiant and soundless. The tower cracked. The symbols on his skin faded to black. The stars returned to their original places, and the figure screamed, not in rage, but in sorrow. We were almost heard. A great wind burst through the sanctum, blowing open every door, window, and seal. James was thrown backward, but he did not resist. He let the sound pass through him. And for the first time since Elijah's letter was found, there was no melody, only silence. Not empty, not dead, sacred. He stood slowly, breathing deep. The Sanctum Auditus had not been a prison. It had been a safeguard, a resting place for those who could carry the burden, not complete it. James was no longer a vessel. He was a vault, and what had once echoed through him was now still. James descended the mountain in silence, the torn remnants of the hymn book sealed inside a satchel he tied shut with old cloth and wax. Each step away from the monastery felt like walking out of a dream he barely survived. The forest no longer hummed with unnatural tones. The sky no longer shimmered with symbols. For the first time in weeks, the world sounded like itself again. But James had changed. Something within him felt quieter, but heavier, as if carrying silence had its own weight. He didn't dream that night, nor the next. Yet in his waking hours, he would sometimes feel the presence of a note not yet played. Not dark, not evil, just ancient, as if the melody was not trying to consume, but to be remembered. A memory so old it had to wear a disguise to survive. Back in town, James found the chapel still in ruins, its burned timbers now overgrown with moss and wildflowers. Where once the organ pipes stood like fangs, now butterflies fluttered. Children played nearby, unaware of what had once slept beneath their feet. And in that simplicity, James found peace. He returned to Miss Althea's house, now boarded up, but tucked beneath the porch, wrapped in cloth, was a small wooden box he hadn't noticed before. Inside, a note written in her delicate hand. "You passed the test." The voice didn't want a singer. It wanted someone who could choose not to sing. Beneath the note, a photograph of Elijah Moore, and beside him, a much younger Althea. They had known. They had prepared. James sat on the porch steps for hours, staring at the picture. He was no prophet, no chosen vessel, just a man who had listened closely enough to know when to stop. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful harmony of all. Years passed. The town slowly forgot the fire. The name Elijah Moore became a whisper in old church records. Miss Althea's home was sold and renovated. Even the stories of the vanished pastor faded into urban legend. Just one more mystery buried beneath modern distractions. But James never forgot. He kept the journal and the burned hymn book in a safe hidden beneath the floorboards of his home. He never opened it again. He never needed to. Sometimes, on late autumn nights, he would walk into the woods and sit under the stars listening, not for melodies, but for silence. And when he found it, he smiled. One afternoon, A boy from the neighborhood came to his door, clutching a broken radio. "Mr. James," he said, "my radio's making weird noises. It sounds like singing, but no one's there." James took the radio gently, turned the knobs, and smiled. "It's just static," he told the boy. "But maybe, sometimes, when we're really quiet, we hear the past humming through the present." He didn't fix the radio. He didn't need to. The boy laughed, curious but unafraid. And James sat there for a while, the radio in his lap, listening once more. The sound was there, just beneath the surface. A single note that had no source. But this time it didn't pull. It didn't beg to be sung. It simply was. And that was enough. Time, as it often does, softened the edges of memory. The world moved on. New churches were built. New preachers came and went. People spoke more of blessings and less of mysteries. But James, older now, carried within him a silence that no sermon could reach. It wasn't a void, but a sanctuary. Something sacred had passed through him and asked to be held, not solved. On the anniversary of the fire, 30 years to the day after Elijah Moore had vanished, James returned to the site of the old chapel. The land was untouched, overgrown, and humming with life. Crickets sang. The wind moved freely through the trees. And yet, James felt it again, that presence. Not threatening, but familiar. Like an old hymn remembered after decades of absence. He knelt where the altar once stood and laid down a small stone, carved with the same 3 symbols that had once appeared on his skin. They had faded completely now, but their meaning remained. He whispered a word, one he didn't know he knew. The forest fell silent, and then a breeze answered him, carrying with it the faintest hum. A note not played, but understood. Behind him, the faint crunch of footsteps. He turned to find a young woman, no older than 20, standing at the edge of the clearing. Her eyes were wide. "I saw something in a dream," she said. 3 shapes. A hymn. A fire. James didn't speak. He only nodded once, slowly, and pointed to the stone. She knelt beside it, placed her hand over it, and smiled. James knew then, this was not the end of the melody, nor its return, but a kind of passing. A sacred relay. The hymn did not crave to be sung aloud anymore. It only sought memory, witness, reverence. It lived on, not in sound, but in story, in silence chosen, in voices that refused to echo without understanding. He walked with her back to the town, answering what questions she had with careful honesty. He told her of Elijah, of Althea, of the hymn book and the sanctuary, of the temptation to become something more than human, and the courage to remain just a man. That night, she stayed in the guest room of James's home, and as he watched her sleep from the doorframe, peaceful, undisturbed, he realized something had changed. The burden had lifted. Whatever the melody had been, it had trusted him to end it gently. Not with violence, not with erasure, but with grace. The final page of Elijah's journal, once blank, now bore a single line James had never seen before. The greatest note is the one never played. And in that truth, James finally slept. Years later, the town erected a small monument near the old chapel grounds. Not many remembered why it was there, or who it honored. The plaque bore no names, only 3 symbols etched into the metal, and a line that puzzled most passers-by. Silence is not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding. Children would sometimes play nearby, running past the stone without reading it, while the elders paused a moment longer, as if the shape of the words pulled at something ancient and unspoken in their bones. James had never asked for a memorial. In fact, he had quietly resisted the idea. But it was the young woman, Mara, who insisted. She told the town council the truth, cloaked in fiction, wrapped it in metaphor, made it safe for modern ears. The monument was her gift, a way of marking the edge of the sacred without naming the storm that had once passed through. Mara would often visit James after school or on weekends, bringing stories from her dreams, asking questions with eyes that had seen too much for her age. He never gave her straight answers, only guidance. "Don't chase the melody," he told her once. "Let it find you, and when it does, ask why it chose your voice." The two of them became an odd pair in the town, an aging man with quiet eyes, and a vibrant girl with more intuition than certainty. Yet between them, something old and holy flowed, like water passed from one vessel to another. There was never talk of prophecy, nor destiny, only stewardship, as if they were not chosen by something divine, but entrusted by something forgotten. One cold evening in late autumn, Mara knocked on James's door with a notebook in her hands. She had transcribed an entire dream, one filled with choirs of wind, buildings made of voice, and shadows shaped like hymns. James read every line in silence, then looked up and asked, "What did it sound like?" Mara closed the notebook gently and said, "Like forgiveness." That word hung in the room, heavier than grief, warmer than fire. Forgiveness. It was the only melody the world had stopped singing. And now, perhaps, through her, it had a chance to rise again. Not in fear, not in power, but in peace. Not long after, James fell ill. It wasn't sudden, nor tragic. It was quiet, a slow winding down, like a song reaching its final verse. He spent his last days in bed, surrounded not by noise or hospital machines, but by letters. Old ones, notes from Elijah, pages from a hymn book he had never dared to burn, the final journal entries from Althea, pieces of the story that had haunted and healed him. Mara sat at his side each evening, sometimes reading to him, sometimes writing her own thoughts while he slept. When he woke, they didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had become a language far deeper than words. One night, as the moon cast silver shadows across the walls, James reached under his bed and retrieved a small wooden box. Inside it was a single item, a page. The last page. Blank, untouched. He handed it to Mara without a word. She looked at him, puzzled, until she saw the faint shimmer along the edge of the paper, like something waiting to be written, or perhaps waiting to appear. James smiled barely. "Don't write what you remember," he whispered. "Write what you hear when the world goes still." Then he closed his eyes and took one final breath. Mara stayed in that room until dawn. She didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, she listened. The wind outside the window hummed low and long. The trees whispered in tones only she could understand. And in that moment, she knew. The hymn had not ended. It had only changed singers. Not louder. Not darker. Just different. Softer. Kinder. Carried now by a voice born in a new time, but bound to the same sacred silence that once chose James. She placed the blank page inside her notebook and closed it. In the years that followed, Mara traveled far. She never claimed to be a prophet or a preacher, but wherever she went, people listened. They didn't know why. Her voice wasn't loud, nor particularly melodic, but something about her words made people pause, reflect, hear something beneath the surface of their own thoughts. Some called it wisdom. Others called it intuition. She knew better. It was the echo of a man who chose silence over power. The final harmony of a story that refused to become a legend, and instead became a legacy. Years passed like turning pages in a book no one had finished. Mara aged, but slowly, as if time had agreed to walk beside her rather than race ahead. She never returned to live in the town where it all began, but she carried it with her. In the scent of old paper, in the hush of empty chapels, in the distant hum of a storm before it touched the earth. She found herself drawn to forgotten places, ruins, abandoned churches, libraries with unread books and attic rooms filled with dust and questions. And in each of those places, she left something behind. Not a song, not a symbol, but silence. Intact silence. She had learned from James that some sanctuaries are not built with hands, but with restraint. Occasionally, she would meet someone whose eyes carried the same echo she once saw in the mirror, the quiet knowing that something greater had brushed against their life and not spoken aloud. Those were the ones she trusted with small pieces of the story. Never the full tale, never names, only fragments, like candlelight passed from wick to wick. She gave them riddles, dreams to follow, songs to avoid, and always the warning. If you hear it clearly, walk away. If it speaks your name, do not answer. Not yet. Most laughed. Some wept. But a few understood, and those few began to listen differently to the world around them. One such listener was a young boy in a coastal village, barely 12, who swore he could hear voices when the tide pulled out too far. His father dismissed it as imagination, but his grandmother simply gave him an old book of hymns and said, "Write what they don't say." Another was a nun in a convent deep in the mountains, who refused to sing for 3 years after dreaming of a man with symbols on his hands standing in fire. She took a vow of silence, and when asked why, she whispered, "Because some notes do not forgive those who rush to repeat them." Mara never interfered. She wasn't building an order or protecting a secret. She was honoring a memory. The memory of Elijah, of Althea, of James, and of the melody that had once tried to become flesh through them. By choosing not to repeat the story, she allowed it to remain sacred. Like a wound that had healed without a scar, she knew that to tell it too loudly would be to turn it into myth. And myths, once spoken enough times, lose their weight. She had no interest in that. Her mission was not to explain. It was to guard the silence between explanations. And then, one day, long after anyone had spoken James's name aloud, Mara stood at the edge of a forgotten chapel ruin on a fog-covered moor. She wasn't sure how she had found the place, only that the dream had brought her there. The stones were old, older than language, covered in moss and time. There was no altar, no pews, only silence, and a hollow in the earth where something once slept. She knelt, as James once had, and pulled from her coat a folded paper. The last page. It was still blank, untouched by ink or fire. And yet, when she held it to the air, it trembled slightly, like a voice waiting to form. She thought of James, of how he had ended the song not by destroying it, but by refusing to carry it forward in its corrupted form. He had rewritten its purpose by not rewriting its words. She wondered if that was the highest kind of faith, not to sing louder, but to listen better, to trust that silence could contain more truth than any chorus. She laid the page in the hollow, pressed it into the earth, and covered it with her hands, not to bury it, but to offer it, to the earth, to time, to whoever might one day come, seeking a voice in the quiet. As she stood to leave, the wind shifted and carried with it a sound. Not a hymn, not even a whisper, just breath. A single, ancient breath, like the earth itself, exhaling. Mara smiled. She understood. The melody had not been waiting to be sung. It had been waiting to be released. And now, finally, after decades of holding it with reverence, she had given it back to the silence that first birthed it. It belonged to no one now. And in that surrender, it had found peace. When Mara disappeared years later, no one searched for her. There were no missing person reports, no panic phone calls. Those who knew her simply nodded. She had gone where the story could not follow. Into the silence she had protected for a lifetime. And in certain places, if you stand very still, you might feel it. The hush before memory, the stillness that holds stories too holy to be told. That is where she remains. Years drifted by, and the world changed in ways James and Mara could never have imagined. Churches became theaters, prayers became posts, and the silence, once revered, was replaced by noise dressed as meaning. But still, beneath all of that, something endured. A rhythm not bound by culture or time. It moved through forgotten places, flickered in the edges of dreams, and echoed in the spaces between words. No longer a melody to be feared or worshipped, it had matured into something rarer. Presence without performance. Memory without monument. Truth without voice. In a dusty archive of a city no one remembered building, a young historian uncovered a box without a label. Inside, pages. Some burned, some blank, some written in a script that faded when touched by light. Among them, a photograph, aged and fragile, of a woman standing in front of 3 stone symbols carved into the face of an ancient ruin. The historian couldn't name her, but her eyes stirred something in him. A memory he didn't own, a feeling he had never been taught. He studied the pages. He heard nothing, but when he closed his eyes, he felt it, like a thought someone else had left behind, waiting to be adopted. He brought the box home that evening, unaware of what he carried. That night, as rain fell soft against the glass, he opened a blank page and stared at it, waiting for something to reveal itself. But nothing came. No vision. No sound. Only a quiet so thick it pressed against his chest. He wasn't afraid. He was still, and that stillness spoke louder than any revelation. It told him that what mattered had already been said, that the story was not waiting for a new verse. It was waiting for the silence to be honored once more. The next day, He placed the box back where he found it, untouched, and left a note of his own inside. Some echoes are not meant to return, only to remind us that they once were. Then he closed the lid and walked away. He never spoke of the experience, not to friends, not in lectures. But for the rest of his life, he paused before answering questions. He listened longer before responding. And in his silence, others heard something truer than words. Somewhere, far from cities, far from history, a child is born under a sky, so clear it looks like breath held still. The child grows, slow and kind, drawn not to noise but to quiet. She hums to herself songs no one taught her, melodies that begin mid-phrase, with no end. Her parents watch her with wonder and worry, unsure of how she knows things no one ever said. She draws symbols in the dirt. She touches books without reading them. She listens to the wind like it's trying to explain something long forgotten. One day, walking alone through an overgrown field, she stops suddenly. Ahead, 3 standing stones rise like ribs from the earth, moss-covered and worn by time. She doesn't gasp or run. She smiles, as if recognizing an old friend. She approaches the center, kneels, and places her ear to the ground. Nothing speaks. No visions come, but a tear rolls down her cheek, not of fear, but of reunion. She has heard this silence before, not in this life, but in some echo of a story passed like a whisper from soul to soul. She doesn't need to know who James was, or Mara, or Elijah. The knowing is in the silence itself. She stays there for hours, not praying, not waiting, just being. And in that moment, the world holds its breath again. Somewhere, a forgotten page disintegrates into soil. Somewhere else, a hymn that was never sung is remembered by no one, yet felt by all. The circle doesn't close, it dissolves like mist at sunrise. Because the story was never meant to be a loop. It was meant to be a breath. Inhale, exhale, once, and then peace. The girl rises. She doesn't look back. And as she walks into the tall grass, the wind shifts, the sun warms the stones, and the earth, once a witness to noise and fire, settles into the oldest sound of all, silence. The years folded gently into decades, and the melody, once a haunting voice, a consuming fire, had become a faint murmur beneath the world's hurried clamor. Mara's legacy lived quietly, passed on through whispers and silences carefully kept. In classrooms, in churches, in the hearts of those who dared to listen closely, her story was a sacred secret, an echo meant not to be shouted, but cherished like a fragile flame in a storm. In a small coastal town, a woman discovered an old music box in her grandmother's attic. Inside, instead of a tune, was a folded letter, faded, nearly illegible, but unmistakably written by Mara. It spoke of choices made, of silence embraced, and of peace earned not through victory, but through surrender. The woman read the letter beneath the glow of a single candle, feeling the weight of generations in the quiet between words. She understood, then, that some songs do not end with applause. They end with a breath held in reverence. She carefully returned the music box to the attic, leaving a small note beside it. For those who find this, listen with your soul, not your ears. And though she never spoke of it, sometimes in the stillness of night, she would hear a faint melody carried by the wind, a song without beginning or end, a harmony woven through the fabric of time itself. The world moves on, but some stories never truly leave us. They rest beneath our feet, in the air we breathe, and in the silent moments when we feel a presence too profound for words. The tale of Elijah Moore, James Whittaker, Mara, and all who carry the melody forward is one such story, a testament to the power of silence, memory, and the choices we make when faced with the unknown. Perhaps the greatest truth they taught us is this: not every voice needs to be heard, and not every song needs to be sung. Some melodies are meant to be held gently, tucked away in the quiet spaces of our souls, where they can breathe without breaking us. Because in the end, the deepest harmony is found not in sound, but in stillness. If you found yourself drawn into this story, if it lingered in your thoughts after the final word, then maybe, just maybe, you are part of this melody too. And your silence, your memory, your reverence, is the note that keeps it alive. Some stories are more than just tales told around a fire. They are echoes of forgotten truths, memories wrapped in silence, and lessons whispered through generations. The journey of Reverend Elijah Moore, James, Mara, and those who carried the weight of a haunting melody reminds us that not all voices need to be heard aloud to make a difference. Sometimes, the most powerful impact comes from what we choose not to speak and what we honor in the quiet. This story teaches us that silence is not weakness, but strength. It is a sanctuary where the most profound healing and understanding can occur. When we listen deeply, not just with ears but with our hearts, we find a space where grief transforms into grace, fear into wisdom, and chaos into peace. The melody was never about control or fear. It was about respect for the boundaries between sound and stillness, between knowing and forgetting. Reflect on your own life and the stories you carry. How many truths have you hidden in silence, either out of fear or love? What power lies in the quiet spaces you protect? Remember that sometimes, choosing to listen quietly is a courageous act, a form of resistance against a world that demands noise and haste. The legacy of this story is a reminder that our greatest strength often lives in restraint, and our deepest connections are forged in shared stillness. If this story moved you, if it stirred a thought or feeling you can't shake, then your silence is part of the melody now. Your presence here is a note in a symphony much larger than any one voice. Keep listening. Keep holding space. Because the stories that survive are not always the loudest. They're the ones kept close to the heart, passed gently, and remembered in reverence. And if you want to continue this journey with us, exploring stories that touch the soul and challenge the mind, make sure to subscribe and join this growing community. Like the video if it resonated with you, and share your thoughts below. Your voice matters, and here, every word, every silence, every interaction is part of a story far greater than ourselves.